This is, without a doubt, going to be the Minnesota Vikings' biggest challenge moving forward after this bye week. But first, let me tell you about Hoagland Farm meat. Hoagland Farm has the best rotationally grazed 100% grass-fed beef. This beef is sold in quarters and halves, and they have custom sample packs so you can try before you buy. Fill your freezers up with delicious steaks, chuck roasts, ground beef, and more. My wife and I did, and we get per pound $4.15. Ground beef, steaks, chuck roasts, all of it. You go to Walmart, go to the nearest grocery store you live by, and it's not even close to that price. So go to Hoagland Farm, contact them today at 952-491-1541 and get 20% off your first order by mentioning the Minnesota Tim podcast. 952-491-1541. Okay, so the Minnesota Vikings' biggest challenge moving forward. The team is 5-0. They're feeling good about themselves. They had one challenging game at the end versus the New York Giants where things just didn't look as crisp. It was a challenge versus the Niners and the Packers as well. But in terms of the crispiness and the sharpness, the Minnesota Vikings looked their worst against the New York Jets. And hopefully that's not a sign of things to come, but it worked out fantastically that the Minnesota Vikings got their bye week, get guys rested up and healed up, and especially after guys got nicked up in the first 5 weeks of the season, specifically Sam Darnold, Justin Jefferson, Aaron Donald, and some of the defensive guys. But without a doubt, the biggest challenge facing the Minnesota Vikings the rest of the season is that they cannot overlook a single opponent that they face, not because the opponents are good or because they stink, but because every single team in the NFC North is so freaking good this season. The worst team in the North is 4-2, and the Minnesota Vikings are 5-0. It takes two missteps, two near loss misses. Huh? Wait, 1 second. It takes two bad losses, two close losses for the Minnesota Vikings to lose this divisional lead. It takes one loss versus the Detroit Lions on Sunday for the Detroit Lions to be number one in the division. And what's so stressful about this is that the Minnesota Vikings have Sam Darnold at the quarterback position. And we already started seeing him come back to earth a little bit. He is not going to perform like he did in the first 4 weeks of the season again this season. He's not going to go 11 touchdowns, 3 picks in a 4-game span a second time this season, which means there's going to be a lot of tough games in the Minnesota Vikings' future, which also means that there could be some shifting in the NFC North. The Chicago Bears and Green Bay Packers are 4-2. The Detroit Lions are 4-1. And this is the first time. Adam Schefter sent out this tweet last night. This is the first time since divisional realignment in 2002, with all 4 teams each having at least 4 wins through 6 weeks. So this is, without a doubt, the Minnesota Vikings' biggest challenge for the rest of the season. Because every single team in the North is on their heels. And there is no room for a 2-week lull or a 3-week lull. You can't lose against the Jaguars or Titans or Bears or Colts or Rams. You need to beat these teams. You can't take a week off or 2 weeks off Or you might find yourself last in the division. And everybody's going to be pointing the finger saying, I knew the Minnesota Vikings weren't real. It was just a matter of time. And I've received a few comments on my post saying, why don't you just be positive? What's up with the negativity? I don't think I'm being negative. What is being negative about sharing facts that the Chicago Bears and Green Bay Packers are the worst teams in the division based on record, and they are still right behind the Minnesota Vikings? What's so negative about that? It's an objective way of looking at things. I think about the New England Patriots back in 2008, and I followed Randy Moss throughout his career because he was the kind of guy that I would want my kids to be like. You know, scoring the referee with bottles. When you have to pay fines, just pay straight cash, homie. So that's why I followed Randy Moss, because he's a great mentor and a very civilized man. And Tom Brady tore his ACL like the first play of the season I think it was against the Chiefs. And I don't remember who it was against. Maybe it was against the Chiefs. And Matt Castle had to step in. Well, season's over, right? Well, the Patriots go 11-5. And they did not make the playoffs. They went 11-5, and they missed the playoffs. Now, it's a little different in 2008 because the Miami Dolphins won the division, but then there was other divisions that were so good that they took a wild card spot away from it. It wasn't the Jets or Bills, or it wasn't from their own division that took their spot away. It was from a different division. But the point still stands. The Patriots went 11-5 with Sam Cassell. Sam Cassell? What? With Matt Castle, and missed the playoffs. The same thing could happen to the Minnesota Vikings. The Minnesota Vikings could go 11-6, and if the division continues the way it is going, they could miss the playoffs at 11-6. You know, and we all have our numbers in our head. Well, if they get to 10-7, well, if they get to 9-8, well, if they get to 11-6, well, then that should be enough for the playoffs. This year, it might not be. With the Bears, Packers, and Lions on the Vikings' heels. And I was just looking at the schedules for the other NFC North teams, and it doesn't get much harder. Let's look at the Lions. We got Minnesota, got the Titans, got the Packers, got their divisional games. At Houston, okay, it's a tougher game. Versus Jacksonville, okay. At Indianapolis, okay. Division. Versus Buffalo is a challenging game. Division, and then at San Fran. Who knows what they're looking like at the end of the season. Probably pretty good with Christian McCaffrey probably back at that game. So there's some challenging games versus the 49ers and Bills and Texans. But then you got a cakewalk against the Titans. You got a cakewalk against the Colts. You got a cakewalk against Jacksonville. And the Vikings have those cakewalk games too. But so does the rest of the division. You still got to win those games. All right, let's take a look at the Green Bay Packers schedule for the rest of the season. Let's just look at what these other teams are going up against. Well, they got Houston this weekend at home. Then they're at Jacksonville. Divisional game. Home versus San Fran versus the crappy injured Dolphins. Divisional game at Seattle versus the New Orleans Saints that have fallen off a cliff. Divisional game. There's not much competition for the Packers there either. They've got two tough games the rest of the way. Versus Houston and versus San Fran. And both of those games are at home. I guess you could argue at Seattle is a challenging game too. But two of their tougher games are at home, just like the Minnesota Vikings had it. So, all right, let's take a look at the Chicago Bears. Let's take a look at their schedule. They're 4-2. And they haven't really beat anybody. They beat the Titans, the Rams, the Panthers, the Jacksonville Jaguars. They beat up on all crappy teams. Let's see. They're at Washington after their bye week. At Arizona. Home versus New England. Home versus Green Bay. Home versus Minnesota. Division. At San Fran. At Minnesota. Division. Versus Seattle. At Green Bay. There's a couple of challenging games in there. At Washington's tough. At San Fran is tough. Versus Seattle, it might be tough. But a lot of divisional games, and then at Arizona. So maybe the Chicago Bears have the toughest schedule the rest of the way. Home versus New England, that's a cakewalk game because they already beat up on their crappy opponents. But as far as the Lions and Packers are concerned, like, it's not like their schedule gets all that much tougher the rest of the way. And the Minnesota Vikings have an easy schedule the rest of the way, too. Let's take a look at their remaining schedule. Because I'm just trying to get us a sense of what we can expect moving forward for the rest of the regular season. All right. Home versus Detroit this weekend. At LA, which is basically a home game. Home versus Indianapolis. At Jacksonville. At Tennessee. Division at Chicago. Home versus Arizona. Home versus Atlanta. Who knows what the Falcons are going to look like. It's a tough game because they're kind of up and down this season. Home versus Chicago division. At Seattle, because we always play at Seattle. And then finish up with 2 divisional games. So the Minnesota Vikings have a few tough games in there the rest of the season. Now, home versus Atlanta, I would assume we'd be favored in that game, but not a guarantee. At Seattle is always tough. They got the divisional games. And I'm not overlooking the fact that we have 3 straight road games. At Jacksonville, at Tennessee, at Chicago. From November 3rd through November 7th. I would not expect the Minnesota Vikings to win every single one of those road games. They'll have a slip up in there for one of those games. And then the quick turnaround this week, you got Sunday versus Detroit, and then Thursday on the road at Los Angeles. That's a tough, quick turnaround. So it's not like the Minnesota Vikings, as easy as that schedule looks, all of their easy opponents this year are on the road. And what made the tougher opponents much more winnable games like the Texans and 49ers is that those are home games. So that was awesome that it was home, but the easy games are not quite as easy because lots of them are road games. So that's just a sense of what we're dealing with, what other teams in the division are dealing with, because there's really no slippage that the Minnesota Vikings can have despite a 5-0 start, because every other team in the division is right there. And the Minnesota Vikings have 5 divisional games left of the season. So this is for sure the biggest challenge facing the Minnesota Vikings the rest of the season.